Hello from AE Education. So today I'll be going through a very commonly tested question in H2 economics exams. So this will be a price mechanism question. So they're asking about total revenue and the concepts of elasticity in this question. So let's just take a quick look at the question here. So part A, they're asking for the likely impact of the above mentioned factors on milk farmers' revenue. So this is a question that is actually testing you the concept of total revenue. Okay, so total revenue. So as you may know, total revenue is actually the product of price times quantity transacted. Okay, so first we have to look at the preamble to actually glean some of the most important facts of the question. Okay, so the question actually states that there is actually economic slowdown in China, and there's the abolition of EU dairy production quotas and record low prices of cattle feed. Okay, so we can actually learn from the question that there's actually very low prices of cattle feed, and there's also the abolition of EU dairy production quotas, and there's also the economic slowdown. Okay, so for a part A question which asks you for the likely impact of the above mentioned factors, it's very simple actually. So what you have to do is to usually give 3 paragraphs to this question, 2 to 3 paragraphs depending on how much time you have. So for this question, I would usually probably give a demand factor and a supply factor that might affect the total revenue. Okay, so first let's look at the demand factor. So for demand factor, we can look at the economic slowdown in China. So what happens when there's an economic slowdown in China? When there is a economic slowdown, it means that there could be an actual the economic slowdown is usually associated with a period of falling incomes, right? So the economic slowdown usually results in a drop in incomes for the most of the population. So that results in a drop in the purchasing power, right? So drop in purchasing power for most of the consumers. So when there's actually a drop in your purchasing power, assuming milk is a normal good, of course, so it's more of like a necessity, right? So it's usually a normal good. So since milk is a normal good, as incomes fall, your purchasing power will fall, and consumers are less willing and able to purchase milk. So of course, naturally, your demand also falls for milk. Okay, so demand for milk drops, and the demand curve will shift leftwards. Okay, of course. So after this, you can actually draw the curve to actually show that the demand curve has shifted leftwards. Okay, so let's actually plan out all the factors first. So for the supply curve, the supply factor in this case would be the abolition of the EU dairy production quotas. So what this means is actually that previously there has been a dairy production quota to limit the amount of milk that a farmer is actually legally able to produce, right? So when the quotas are actually removed, producers will actually they would feel that they can increase their production so that they can earn more revenue and thus probably profits, right? So in that case, the supply of milk will likely increase because farmers are incentivized to produce more milk. So abolition of quotas would likely result in a supply increase, okay? So a supply increase, and the supply will increase, the supply curve will increase, and shift rightwards. Yeah, okay. So now these are the demand factors and the supply factors, but that is not all, of course. So we have not really answered the essence of the question, which is actually to address the likely impact on milk farmers' revenue. Okay, so let's go back to the first paragraph here. So economic slowdown. So we have understood that the demand curve has shifted leftwards. So for this kind of factors, right, it's always important for you to bring some kind of elasticity factors to actually show that you have understood the demands of the question. So if you're looking at the demand factor, for example, this is related to an income factor, right? So this is because of the economic slowdown. So an relevant elasticity concept that we could bring here is actually your income elasticity of demand, which is your YED. Okay. So what the YED actually shows is that it shows the extent of the increase in the demand curve. Okay? Shows extent of increase. So what this means is that it can actually show whether it has increased slightly or whether it has increased greatly. So in this case, for milk, it is a very normal good because it's more of like a necessity. So it's a necessity good. So it is actually a normal good. Okay. So the YED value is probably between 0 and 1. Okay. So what this means is that the demand curve will shift less than proportionally to the fall in. The demand curve will actually shift leftwards less than proportionally to the fall in income. Okay. Yeah. So it looks something like this. So it's a very small decrease in your demand curve. So in that case, you can actually show that the total revenue falls, but not to a very large extent. So perhaps you can just say that total revenue falls to a smaller extent because of the very minimal shift in your demand curve. Okay? So this is how you can actually explain this. Whereas for supply, you can always bring in the PED concept here. So my trick is for that usually this. So if you are shifting the supply curve, then you can usually bring in the PED to actually show the extent of the price changes and the quantity changes. Okay? So let's see how it works here. So if you're shifting supply in this case, so we're shifting supply, we use PED. Okay? So PED. So in this case, we can first figure out what is the value of PED for milk in this case. So PED for milk is probably less than 1 because milk is habitually consumed and constitutes a small proportion of an average consumer's income. So in that case, you can very safely assume that the PED is going to be likely less than 1. So it is actually inelastic demand. And this also shows that your demand curve, you have to draw it very steeply. Okay, so it'll be something like this. And so the supply curve shifts rightwards. So this is the shift in supply curve. So in this case, you can actually tell from here. So this was the previous price. So this is S0, S1, D. And this is the previous price, previous quantity. And here is the new price and the new quantity. So you can actually see that there has been a fall in the total revenue as the price has fallen. The increase in supply causes a fall in the price of milk, ceteris paribus, and leads to a less than proportionate rise in the quantity demanded. So this results in a fall in total revenue, as you can see from this areas here. So if you compare the purple area and the black area, of course, the purple area is much larger than the black area, so it actually shows that the total revenue has fallen. So because of that, you can very safely assume that the total revenue has fallen. Okay, so let's look at the answer. So this is just the planning we have done so far. So it's always good for you to do some planning before you actually attempt the question. Okay, just to, solidify your thoughts and ideas. So you can always go back to so this is how you properly explain the question. So economic slowdown is usually associated with a period of falling incomes. So since milk is a normal good, as incomes fall, purchasing power falls and consumers are less willing and able to purchase milk. Thus, demand for milk falls. So I think here you can actually bring in your price mechanism explanation. So here is where you actually try to explain that the prices of this will actually fall because there has been a surplus, and because of that, there's a downward pressure on prices and all this. So the answer key failed to mention this, but of course you can mention this in your exam papers. So after that, after you explain the fall in prices, right, you can bring in your YED, and then you can explain the rationale for your chosen YED value. So in this case, they have assumed that the YED is between 0 and 1 because it's a necessity. So it's a normal good necessity. So in that case, it means that when income falls, demand falls less than proportionally. So in that case, you can very safely assume the total revenue of milk farmers fall, but to a small extent. So that's the key idea here. So due to the small value of YED, you can very safely assume that. So now we can move on to the second paragraph, which is the abolition of the dairy production quotas. So dairy production quotas is a quantitative limit on the amount of milk that a farmer is legally able to produce for a given period of time. So it's always good for you to define the key terms of the question. So quota, it's a very common term, so you can try to define it as a limit, limit instated on the producers of milk. So when the quotas are removed, of course, producers want to increase their own total revenue and everything. So supply is likely to increase, and ceteris paribus. Total effect on total revenue depends on the relative price elasticity of demand of milk. So, of course, if PED is less than 1, the total revenue will fall. Whereas if PED is more than 1, the total revenue is going to increase. So in this case, we need to pick a value. So in this case, we have assumed that the demand for milk is price inelastic. So an increase in the supply will actually cause a fall in the price of milk and lead to a less than proportionate rise in the quantity demanded. So the curve that I showed just now illustrates the fall in total revenue. Okay. Yeah. So remember, I also said that there was going to be 3 points to the question, right? See, 3 paragraphs. So the last paragraph will be to actually do a combined shift of the demand and supply curve. So we had shown just now that the demand has decreased and the supply has increased. So we're going to do a combined shift here. So before that, we need to try to assume or, pick a side, whether the supply curve increases more or the demand curve decreases more. So in this case, we have assumed that there's actually an increase in supply and a fall in demand, and the increase in supply exceeds the fall in demand, as demand is likely to fall less than proportionally when income falls. So this is related to the previous part on the YED, which shows that the demand curve has shifted very less than proportionally. So of course, the increase in supply is going to exceed that. So at the initial equilibrium price, there's going to be a surplus as quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. So this puts a downward pressure on prices, and overall price falls to P1 where the surplus is eliminated. So overall price has fallen to P1 and quantity is increased to Q1. So you can just draw the curves again and just show that the total revenue falls. So that's it for 10 marks. So there is no need for any conclusion. So you just need a full elaborated paragraph, well-developed answer addressing all 3 changes in the preamble. Okay, so you just need a depth of clarity of analysis and a link to total revenue. So it's important to link to the concept of total revenue, which is price times quantity. So the best way to do so is to use a diagram. So if you do not really use a diagram, it's going to be hard for you to explain the link. Okay. So, and it is also very important for you to explain the process of price adjustment. So you need to use the key terms such as shortage or surplus wherever the keywords apply, and also need to show the changes in prices and how the changes in prices occur through the price adjustment. Okay. Okay, so now let's look at part B of the question, which is to evaluate the impact on falling milk prices on related markets. So this question is quite straightforward as well. So it's a very commonly tested question. So follow up to the part A question. So evaluate the impact on related markets. So it is first, we need to define the idea of related markets. So what related markets usually mean is these 3 markets. So related markets, the first related market would be a substitute. Okay? So for example, it would be a substitute of milk. So in this case, maybe they're talking about cow milk. So a possible substitute could be soy milk or almond milk, for example. So the next related market we could talk about is complements. So complements of milk. What do you usually consume with milk? What goes together with milk? So one of the usual examples is probably cereal or cookies. And the next one would be milk as a factor of production. So a market where milk is being used as a factor of production. So the common examples for these are probably butter, cheese, or ice cream. Okay? So maybe let's just pick a few examples first. So let's pick soy milk for this. Let's pick cereal for this. Let's pick ice cream for this. Okay. So now we have also, we also know that the prices of milk have fallen. So maybe we can try to plan out the impact first. So what happens when prices of milk falls and for the substitute? So when the prices of milk fall, it means that there's actually a increase in the quantity demanded for milk. This is because the prices of milk has fallen, so of course quantity demanded will increase. So when quantity demanded of milk increases, consumers will switch away from consuming milk substitutes to consuming milk because milk is cheaper, and thus the demand for milk substitutes will fall from D0 to D1. So in this case, demand for milk substitutes will fall. And for the elasticity concept that we could always use the XED because these are substitutes. And cross elasticity of demand will always help to measure the impact of the decrease in demand. Okay. And for complements, of course, it's the opposite. So when the prices of milk fall, there's an increase in the quantity demanded for milk. So in that case, there will be an increase in demand for the complements. And of course, same thing, we can use XED for this. Whereas for the milk as a FOP, right, usually you use milk as a factor of production. So when the prices of milk fall, it will lead to a drop in the cost of production of the ice cream market, right? So in that case, it will lead to a increase in the supply. So there's an increase in the supply. So if you recall what I said from part A, if you actually shift your supply curves, you could use your PD to actually determine the impact on the total revenue. Okay, so this is how you do a short planning within 5 minutes for this question. So now let's look at the answer. Okay, so now let's look at the substitutes market. So first, it's always good to define the key terms. So in this case, you can define your XED or CED. So after that, we can move on to the talking about the substitutes of milk. So CED of milk and the substitutes will likely be above zero because it's a substitute relationship. So substitutes, their XED or CED will always be more than zero. So you need to also you also need to explain whether they are strong substitutes or weak substitutes. So we can do that. So they fulfill the same need for calcium. So always the rationale for goods being substitutes is that they fulfill the same need or function. Okay, so of course you can elaborate and try to contextualize based on the given context. So a fall in the price of milk will thus increase quantity demanded for milk and decrease demand for substitutes. So of course you can give some examples as well. So soy milk, almond milk, and all this. So when the price of milk falls, consumers switch away from consuming milk substitutes to consuming milk because it's relatively cheaper, and thus demand for milk substitutes falls from D0 to D1. So in this case, we actually show that the total revenue has actually fallen. So that is the given analysis from this. So just need to explain in brief the price mechanism and everything. So a fall in demand will create a surplus and puts a downward pressure on prices. So price and quantity falls to P1 and Q1 respectively, and your total revenue will fall as well. Of course, you can try to do a quick evaluation here. So, of course, the extent of impact will depend on the degree of substitutability and of between milk and the substitutes. So basically, it depends on whether the closeness of the relationship between milk and the substitutes. So there's an example here. So some of them will actually won't switch to consuming milk if they are lactose intolerant, for example. So if they are usually consuming soy milk, they might not really necessarily switch to the cow milk, even though the prices have dropped. So in that case, they may not be a very strong substitute. So that is a determining factor on the impact of the extent of the impact of total revenue falling. Of course, it also depends on the availability and the ease of accessing substitutes. So, of course, some countries may not really have soy milk or almond milk being very accessible. So, in that case, the extent will vary between different countries or different backgrounds or whatever. So, these are some evaluation points we can give. So, the second related market would be the products made from milk, dairy products. So, as milk is a factor of production for dairy products, a fall in price of milk will lead to a lowered cost of production for dairy products. So when the cost of production falls, producers are more willing and able to produce. So in that case, the supply of dairy products will increase. So overall price will fall and quantity will increase. So of course, I can give an example here. So perhaps we have shown the ice cream market. So the extent or the effect on the total revenue will depend on the PED of the dairy product. So either the total revenue could increase or decrease. So you're not really sure yet. So you need to look at the PED value to determine that. So for ice cream, you can try to make an analysis. So for example, you could say that the PED for ice cream is more than 1 because there's a lot of substitutes for ice cream, because ice cream is usually a dessert product, right? And there's a lot of substitutes for desserts. So in that case, we can safely assume that the PED is more than 1, and you can just draw the curve and show how the total revenue will rise. Of course, the extent of impact will also determine, it will also depend on the importance of milk as a factor of production for these products. So if milk is a very important factor of production in the making of ice cream, of course, the cost of producing ice cream will go down significantly. But if milk is a very small or insignificant factor of production, then of course there might not be many very significant change in the cost of production. So that is how you can explain the evaluation points. So the third market would be to explain the complements of milk. So complements, the CED of milk and its complements likely to be less than 0. So the falling price of milk will thus lead to an increase in the demand for the complements, like what I said earlier. So you can just give some examples like Oreo cookies, cereal, etc. So when the price of milk falls, more milk will be consumed. Thus, the demand for its complements will rise from D0 to D1, as shown by this curve here. So it's basically just the opposite of what I mentioned for the substitutes part. So basically, price and quantity will increase. Thus, total revenue increases unambiguously. Of course, evaluation, you can just rehash the same thing you used earlier. So it depends on the relationship between the complements. So sometimes for these complements, they might not have a very strong relationship because, for example, if you use milk and cereal, not everyone consumes milk with cereal, right? So in this case, we can assume that sometimes they might not really have a strong complementary relationship. So it might be quite one-sided. So the impact is likely to be negligible. So those are some points you could say. Yeah. So now we can move on to the conclusion. So a 50-mark essay question would require a conclusion. So in the conclusion, we can also state that there is actually going to be a fall in milk prices. It might have both positive and negative impact on related markets. So as for the market for complements, there's likely to going to be a increase, the positive impact, whereas for the dairy products market or the substitute market, you're not so sure yet. So of course, you can talk about which market has the greatest impact. So dairy product market is likely going to be having the greatest impact because milk is a direct factor of production in it, and it has a very strong relationship between milk and the final product. Of course, the degree of impact depends on the closeness of the relationship between the two goods and the importance of milk as a factor of production. So again here, this is the main point that we are actually analyzing from the previous paragraphs. So it's very important to show that, and the closeness of the relationship between the two goods is the determining factor of the extent of total revenue changes. Of course, there's also various other factors that might affect the market. So what we have analyzed is very it's a ceteris paribus assumption mainly. So of course, there's a lot of other factors that might affect the changes in total revenue and prices and quantity. So the impact on related markets will differ across countries due to differing tastes and preferences and income levels as well. So income levels is one of the main factors here as well. So YED values could change based on the different countries. Okay, yeah. I hope you have understood more about how to answer many price mechanism questions. And if you like this lesson, maybe you can consider joining AE Education. Thank you very much.